Welcome, dear friends, to a tale of unexpected connections and second chances that will warm your heart and remind you of the extraordinary power of family bonds. Enjoy the story. Dr. Robert Thompson was a man of contradictions. At 50, he was at the peak of his career, a respected surgeon at Eastside Private Hospital, one of the most exclusive medical facilities in Chicago. His salt and pepper hair and piercing blue eyes gave him an air of distinguished authority that both intimidated and attracted those around him. Yet, despite his prestigious position and the hefty paycheck that came with it, Robert couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was missing in his life. It was a crisp autumn morning when Robert pulled into the parking lot of St. Mary's Public Hospital, a far cry from the gleaming towers of Eastside Private. The building was old, the paint peeling in places, but to Robert it felt more like home than his posh office across town. Dr. Thompson, a young nurse, called out as he entered the bustling emergency room. "We weren't expecting you today. Is everything all right?" Robert smiled warmly. "Everything's fine, Jenny. Just thought I'd stop by and see if you needed an extra pair of hands." Jenny's face lit up. "Oh, thank goodness. We're swamped today. There's a patient in bed 3 who could really use your expertise." As Robert made his way to bed 3, he could feel the eyes of the other doctors and nurses on him. He knew what they were thinking. What was a hotshot private surgeon doing slumming it in a public hospital? But Robert didn't care. This was where he felt he could make a real difference. The patient in bed 3 was a young man named Carlos, his face contorted in pain from a badly infected appendix. "Don't worry, son," Robert said reassuringly as he examined the swollen abdomen. "We'll have you fixed up in no time." 3 hours later, Robert emerged from the operating room tired but satisfied. Carlos would make a full recovery, all because Robert happened to stop by on his day off. As he was washing up, Dr. Patel, the head of surgery at St. Mary's, approached him. "Robert, I don't know how to thank you. You probably saved that boy's life today." Robert shrugged off the praise. "It's nothing really, I'm just glad I could help." Dr. Patel shook his head in amazement. "I don't understand you, Thompson. You could be lounging by a pool somewhere counting your money. Instead, you're here, working for free. Why?" Robert's eyes took on a distant look. "Because this is what being a doctor is all about, Patel. It's not about the money or the prestige. It's about helping people who need it most." As Robert drove home that evening, he couldn't help but feel a sense of that had been missing from his work at Eastside Private. But little did he know, his life was about to take a turn that would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself and his past. The following Friday started like any other day for Robert. He arrived at Eastside Private Hospital at 7 a.m. sharp, his crisp white coat a stark contrast to the designer suits of the administrators he passed in the hallway. He had a light schedule that day, a routine gallbladder removal and some post-op checkups, nothing he couldn't handle in his sleep. As he settled into his plush office, his secretary Amanda buzzed in. "Dr. Thompson, there's a call for you online too. It's Dr. Harrison, and he says it's urgent." Robert frowned. Dr. Harrison was the head of his department, and urgent usually meant trouble. He picked up the phone, bracing himself for bad news. "Thompson here." "What's the situation, Harrison?" Dr. Harrison's voice crackled over the line, tension evident in every word. "Robert, I need a huge favor. We've got an emergency case at Pinewood Community Hospital about an hour outside the city. Young woman, 23 years old, pregnant with triplets. She needs an emergency C-section, and their surgeon is out with the flu." Robert's mind raced. Pinewood was a small rural hospital barely equipped for routine procedures, let alone a high-risk delivery like this. "What about Dr. Keller? Isn't he on call for emergencies?" Harrison sighed heavily. "Keller's still green, Robert. This is too risky for him. We need your expertise. I know it's a lot to ask, but—" "I'll do it," Robert interrupted, already reaching for his car keys. "Have them prep the OR, I'm on my way." As Robert sped down the highway, his heart pounding with a mix of adrenaline and anticipation, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just another emergency call. Something about this felt different, almost fateful. Little did he know, he was driving straight towards a revelation that would turn his world upside down. The halls of Pinewood Community Hospital were a far cry from the polished corridors of Eastside Private. The linoleum floors were scuffed, the walls in desperate need of a fresh coat of paint, but none of that mattered to Robert. As he burst through the doors of the operating room, his mind solely focused on the task at hand. "Status report," he barked, barely glancing at the nervous-looking staff as he scrubbed in. A young nurse, her eyes wide with a mix of awe and fear, quickly rattled off the patient's vitals. Sarah Wilson, 23 years old, 34 weeks pregnant with triplets, blood pressure's elevated, fetal heartbeats are strong, but showing signs of distress. Robert nodded, his experienced eyes quickly assessing the situation as the patient was wheeled in. Sarah was tiny, her swollen belly looking almost comically large on her petite frame. Her face was pale, beaded with sweat, but her eyes were clear and determined. "Sarah," Robert said softly, leaning down to meet her gaze. "I'm Dr. Thompson. We're going to take good care of you and your babies, okay?" Sarah nodded weakly, managing a small smile. "Thank you, doctor. I trust you." As the anesthesiologist began his work, Robert focused on preparing for the procedure. He had performed countless C-sections in his career, but triplets always added an extra layer of complexity. Every move had to be precise, every decision lightning fast. The operation began smoothly, Robert's skilled hands moving with practiced ease. One by one, he delivered the tiny infants, 2 boys and a girl, each one letting out a healthy cry as they entered the world. The relief in the room was palpable as the last baby was safely delivered. It was as Robert was finishing up, his mind already moving on to post-op care, that he saw it. As he was removing the surgical drapes, his eyes caught a glimpse of Sarah's ankle. There, just above her left foot, was a birthmark. But not just any birthmark. It was large, oddly shaped, almost like a lopsided star. Robert froze, his heart suddenly pounding in his ears. He knew that birthmark. He had seen it every day of his life on his own ankle. "Dr. Thompson? Is everything all right?" The concerned voice of the scrub nurse snapped him back to reality. Robert shook his head, trying to clear the fog of confusion and shock. Yes, everything's fine. Let's get her closed up and into recovery." As he finished the procedure, Robert's mind was racing. The birthmark could be a coincidence, of course, but combined with Sarah's age, her physical resemblance to, no, it couldn't be. Could it? Robert knew one thing for certain. He needed answers. And he wasn't leaving this hospital until he got them. The next morning, Robert found himself outside Sarah's hospital room, his hand hesitating on the doorknob. He had barely slept, his mind churning with questions and possibilities. He had to know the truth, but he was terrified of what he might discover. Taking a deep breath, he knocked softly and entered. Sarah was sitting up in bed, cradling one of the triplets in her arms. Her face lit up when she saw him. "Dr. Thompson, I'm so glad you're here. I wanted to thank you properly for everything you did for us yesterday." Robert managed a smile, trying to keep his voice steady. "It was my pleasure, Sarah. How are you feeling?" As they talked, Robert's trained eye couldn't help but notice the little details, the shape of Sarah's nose, the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled. It was like looking at a ghost from his past. Finally, he couldn't hold back any longer. "Sarah, I hope you don't mind me asking, but do you know much about your birth parents?" Sarah's smile faltered, confusion clouding her features. "My birth parents? I was adopted as a baby. I don't know much about them." "Why do you ask?" Robert's heart was pounding so hard he was sure Sarah could hear it. "I noticed a birthmark on your ankle during the surgery. It's identical to one I have." Sarah's eyes widened. "What are you saying, Dr. Thompson?" Robert took a deep breath. "Sarah, I think there's a possibility that I might be your father." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Sarah's face went through a range of emotions: shock, disbelief, hope, fear. "But how?" she finally managed to whisper. Robert sank into the chair beside her bed, his legs suddenly feeling weak. "About 24 years ago, I was in love with a nurse named Anna. We were young, just starting our careers. My parents, they didn't approve. They forced us apart. I never knew." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Dr. Thompson, Robert, I don't know what to say. It's overwhelming." Robert nodded, fighting back his own tears. "I know, and I'm sorry to drop this on you, especially right now, but I had to tell you. We need to know for sure." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the sleeping baby in her arms. Finally, she looked up, determination replacing the shock in her eyes. "You're right. We do need to know. What do we do now? Robert squared his shoulders. Now, we get a DNA test, and we pray for the truth, whatever it might be. As he left Sarah's room, Robert felt like he was walking in a dream. In the span of 24 hours, his entire world had been turned upside down. But as he looked back at Sarah, surrounded by her newborn triplets, he couldn't help but feel a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he had found the missing piece he'd been searching for all his life. The next few days passed in a blur for Robert. He had taken an emergency leave of absence from Eastside Private, citing a family crisis. It wasn't far from the truth. He spent most of his time at Pinewood, helping Sarah with the triplets and getting to know her better. Every conversation, every shared laugh, only served to strengthen Robert's conviction that Sarah was his daughter. But he knew they couldn't rely on feelings alone. They needed proof. On the third day after the birth, Robert collected DNA samples from himself and Sarah. He sent them off to a private lab he trusted, calling in a favor to get the results expedited. "How long will it take?" Sarah asked nervously, as Robert returned from the hospital lab. "A couple of days, maybe 3, Robert replied, trying to keep his own anxiety in check. "I've asked them to rush it." Sarah nodded, her eyes distant. What? What happens if it's true? If you really are my father?" Robert sat down heavily in the chair beside her bed. "I don't know, Sarah. I guess that's up to you. I've missed out on 23 years of your life. I'd like to be a part of it now, if you'll let me. But I'll understand if you need time or space." Sarah reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "I'd like that too. It's funny, I've always felt like something was missing. Maybe this is it." As they sat there, hand in hand, Robert felt a sense of peace wash over him. Whatever the test results showed, he knew his life would never be the same. But their moment of tranquility was short-lived. A commotion in the hallway caught their attention, and suddenly, the door burst open. A young man stormed in, his face a mask of anger and determination. Behind him, a harried-looking woman in expensive clothes tried to hold him back. "Where is she?" the man demanded, his eyes locking onto Sarah. "Where's the surrogate? Those are our babies." Robert stood up, positioning himself between the intruder and Sarah's bed. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to calm down and leave. This is a hospital room, not a courtroom." The young man sneered. "Do you know who I am?" "I'm Eric Caldwell. My father-in-law is the district attorney. Those babies are legally ours, and we're here to take them home." Sarah's face had gone pale, her arms instinctively tightening around the baby she was holding. "No," she whispered. "No, you can't take them. They're mine. I changed my mind." Eric's face contorted with rage. "Changed your mind? You can't do that. We had a contract." Robert's mind was reeling. Sarah was a surrogate? This complicated things even further. But one look at the terror on Sarah's face steeled his resolve. "Mr. Caldwell," Robert said, his voice low, "and I don't care who your father-in-law is. These babies were born less than 72 hours ago. Sarah is their biological mother, and right now her health and the health of these infants is my only concern. If you don't leave this room immediately, I'll have security remove you." Eric opened his mouth to argue further, but the woman behind him, presumably his wife, put a hand on his arm. "Eric, stop. We can't do this here. We need to talk to our lawyer." With a final glare at Sarah and Robert, Eric allowed himself to be led out of the room, but as he reached the door, he turned back. "This isn't over. Those are our children, and we will get them back." As the door closed behind them, Sarah burst into tears. Robert sat on the edge of her bed, pulling her into a comforting embrace. "Shh, it's okay," he murmured. "I won't let them take your babies, Sarah, I promise." As he held his potential daughter, feeling her shoulders shake with sobs, Robert knew he was making a promise he might not be able to keep. But in that moment, he would have moved heaven and earth to protect Sarah and her children. Little did he know, the biggest shock was yet to come. The next morning, Robert arrived at the hospital early, determined to get some answers about the surrogacy situation. He had spent half the night researching surrogacy laws, and he knew Sarah's position was precarious at best. As he approached Sarah's room, he heard raised voices. His heart sinking, he quickened his pace, fearing Eric had returned. But when he burst through the door, the scene that greeted him was beyond anything he could have imagined. Eric was there, yes, but he wasn't alone. Standing beside him, her hand on his shoulder, was a face Robert hadn't seen in over 2 decades. A face he had never forgotten. "Anna," he gasped, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman turned, her eyes widening in shock as they met Robert's. "Robert, oh my God, Robert, is that really you?" For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. Robert felt like he was looking at a ghost, an older, more sophisticated version of the young nurse he had fallen in love with all those years ago. Anna took a step towards him, her hand reaching out as if to touch him, then falling back to her side. I can't believe it. After all these years, Eric's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Mom, you know this guy? Mom?" Robert's mind reeled. If Anna was Eric's mother, then that meant... Anna's eyes filled with tears as she looked between Robert and Eric. "Oh, Robert, there's so much I need to tell you. Eric is your son." The room erupted into chaos. Sarah gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Eric stumbled backwards, his face a mask of confusion and anger. "What the hell are you talking about, Mom?" Eric demanded. "Dad died when I was a kid. You always said..." "I know what I said," Anna interrupted, her voice trembling. "And Frank was your dad in every way that mattered. But biologically, Robert is your father." Robert felt like the floor was tilting beneath his feet. He groped for a chair, sinking into it as the full weight of Anna's words hit him. "How?" he managed to croak out. "Why didn't you tell me?" Anna's face crumpled. "I wanted to, Robert. God, I wanted to so badly. But by the time I found out I was pregnant, your father had already forced me out of my job. He threatened to ruin my career if I ever contacted you again. I was young, scared. I didn't know what else to do." Robert's mind was reeling. He had a son, a grown son, who was trying to take away the babies of the woman who might be his daughter. The irony of the situation would have been laughable if it wasn't so heartbreaking. "So let me get this straight," Eric said, his voice tight with anger. "You're telling me that this guy is my real father? And what, Sarah is my sister?" "Half-sister," Robert corrected automatically, then winced as he saw the hurt flash across Eric's face. "I'm sorry, that's not... Look, we don't know for sure about Sarah yet. We're waiting on DNA test results." Sarah, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up. "This is insane. So you're saying that I might have carried my own brother's babies?" The room fell silent as the full implications of the situation sank in. Robert looked from Eric to Sarah, seeing the same shocked disbelief mirrored on both their faces. His children, both of them, potentially his children. Anna stepped forward, her eyes pleading. "I know this is a lot to take in, for all of us, but maybe this is a chance for us to be a family. The family we should have been all along." Eric scoffed. "Family? You expect me to just accept this stranger as my father? To give up my children to a sister I never knew I had?" "They're not your children, Eric," Sarah said firmly, her arms tightening around the baby she was holding. "They're mine. I carried them. I gave birth to them. I love them." Robert stood up, his head spinning, but his resolve firm. "Okay, everyone needs to calm down. We can't change the past, but we can decide how we move forward from here. Eric, Anna, I think we need to talk. Privately. Sarah needs her rest." As they filed out of the room, Robert paused at the door, looking back at Sarah. She met his eyes, and he saw in them a mixture of fear, hope, and determination that mirrored his own feelings. "It's going to be okay," he said softly, not sure if he was reassuring her or himself. "We'll figure this out." Sarah nodded, managing a small smile. "I know we will." "Dad." The word hit Robert like a physical blow, filling him with a warmth he had never experienced before. Whatever happened next, he knew his life would never be the same. The next few days were a blur of emotional conversations, legal consultations, and anxious waiting. Robert, Anna, Eric, and Sarah spent hours talking, crying, and sometimes shouting, as they tried to navigate the complex web of relationships they had suddenly found themselves in. Eric, initially hostile, began to soften as he learned more about Robert and the circumstances that had kept them apart. "I always wondered why Mom never talked much about my biological father," he admitted during one of their talks. "I guess now I know why." Sarah, for her part, was struggling to reconcile her feelings about the babies with the newfound knowledge about the situation. "I never intended to keep them," she confessed to Robert one evening. "I just needed the money for my dad's medical bills, but now I can't imagine giving them up." Robert found himself in the strange position of mediator, trying to balance everyone's needs and feelings. It was exhausting, but also exhilarating. For the first time in his life, he felt truly needed, not just as a doctor, but as a father and a man. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the DNA results arrived. Robert gathered everyone in Sarah's hospital room, his hands shaking slightly as he opened the envelope. "Well?" Anna asked, her voice tight with tension. Robert took a deep breath. "Eric, you are my son." He paused, then turned to Sarah. "But Sarah, you and I are not related." The room fell silent. Sarah's face showed a mix of relief and disappointment. I don't know how to feel," she admitted. "Part of me was hoping." Robert moved to her side, taking her hand. "Sarah, blood doesn't make a family. These past few weeks getting to know you and helping with the babies, you may not be my daughter by birth, but I care about you as if you were." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "That means more than you know." Eric was quiet for a long moment, then stood up. I need some time to process this, but I'm glad to know the truth." As Eric left the room, his wife following close behind, Robert turned to Anna. "We have a lot to talk about," he said softly. Anna nodded, tears in her eyes. "We do, but Robert, I never stopped loving you. All these years I've wondered what might have been." Robert felt his heart swell. Despite the complexity of the situation, despite the years of separation and the pain of missed opportunities, he knew in that moment that he still loved Anna too. "So where do we go from here?" Sarah asked, looking between Robert and Anna. Robert smiled, feeling for the first time in years that he was exactly where he was meant to be. "We move forward, together as a family, not by blood, but by choice." Over the next week, as Sarah recovered and the triplets grew stronger, the newly formed family worked to figure out their future. Eric and his wife, after much soul-searching and long conversations with a therapist, made a decision that surprised everyone. "We've decided not to pursue custody of the babies," Eric announced one afternoon, his wife nodding solemnly beside him. It's not right. Sarah is their mother and she clearly loves them. We can't take that away from her." Sarah's eyes filled with tears of relief and gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have no idea what this means to me." Eric managed a small smile. "We do want to be involved in their lives, though, if that's okay with you. As their, well, I guess as family friends," Sarah nodded enthusiastically. "Of course, you're all part of their story now." Robert watched this exchange with a sense of pride and awe. These people who had been strangers just weeks ago were now working together, supporting each other. It was more than he could have ever hoped for. Anna, who had been quietly supportive throughout the whole ordeal, finally spoke up. "I think it's time we address the elephant in the room," she said, her eyes meeting Robert's. "Where do we go from here? All of us." Robert took a deep breath. He had been thinking about this constantly, turning over possibilities in his mind. Now looking at the faces of his newfound family, he knew what he wanted. "I want us to be a family," he said firmly. "All of us. I know it's not conventional. We're not all related by blood. But family is more than that. It's about love, support, and choosing to be there for each other. I want to try, if you'll all have me." The room was quiet for a moment, then Sarah reached out and took Robert's hand. "I'd like that," she said softly. "You've been more of a father to me in these past weeks than anyone ever has." Eric nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "Yeah, it's weird, but good weird. I'm in." Anna's eyes shimmered with tears as she looked at Robert. "I never stopped hoping for this day," she whispered. As they all came together in a somewhat awkward but heartfelt group hug, Robert felt a sense of completeness he had never experienced before. This was what he had been missing all along, not just success or prestige, but family, love, belonging, and it didn't matter that it wasn't a traditional family. It was theirs, and it was perfect. The next few months were a whirlwind of changes. Sarah, with Robert and Anna's help, moved into a comfortable apartment near the hospital. Robert split his time between his work at Eastside Private and helping Sarah with the triplets, relishing his new role as both father and grandfather. Eric and his wife became regular visitors, doting on their niece and nephews. The initial awkwardness between Eric and Robert slowly gave way to a tentative but growing father-son bond. Anna, to everyone's surprise, decided to return to nursing. "Watching you all these years, Robert," she said one evening as they sat on his porch watching the sunset. "It reminded me of why I got into medicine in the first place, to help people. Robert smiled, taking her hand in his. "It's never too late to follow your passion," he said softly. Their relationship, rekindled after so many years apart, blossomed slowly but steadily. They took things day by day, rediscovering each other and building something new on the foundation of their old love. As the triplets grew, hitting milestone after milestone, Robert found himself overwhelmed with joy and gratitude. Watching Sarah become a confident, loving mother, seeing Eric soften and open up, feeling Anna's hand in his, it was more than he had ever dared to dream of. 1 year after the fateful C-section that had changed all their lives, the entire family gathered at Robert's house for a barbecue. The triplets, now toddling around on unsteady legs, were the center of attention, their laughter filling the air. As Robert stood at the grill, expertly flipping burgers, he felt a presence beside him. It was Anna, her eyes sparkling with happiness. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, bumping his shoulder playfully. Robert smiled, looking out at their assembled family. Sarah was chasing one of the triplets, while Eric helped another build a tower of blocks. His 2 children, once strangers, now thick as thieves. "I was just thinking about how lucky I am," he said softly. "A year ago I thought I had everything I could want. A successful career, respect, money, but I was so empty inside. And now you have a family," Anna finished for him, taking his hand. Robert nodded, squeezing her hand gently. "I have everything I never knew I needed." As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the backyard, Robert gathered everyone's attention. "I'd like to make a toast," he said, raising his glass. "To family, to second chances, and to the unexpected twists of fate that bring us where we're meant to be." As glasses clinked and cheers went up, Robert felt a sense of peace wash over him. The mysterious birthmark that had started this whole journey remained unexplained, a quirk of genetics perhaps. But Robert no longer needed an explanation. He had found his place in the world, surrounded by the love of the family he had always longed for. In that moment, looking at the faces of his children, his grandchildren, and the woman he loved, Dr. Robert Thompson knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The journey had been long and often painful, but every step had led him here, to this perfect moment of belonging. And as the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Robert silently thanked whatever twist of fate had brought him to that operating room a year ago. It had been the beginning of the greatest adventure of his life, the adventure of family, of love, and of finally coming home.